So our first panelist is Marcus Casey, Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Illinois at Chicago.
Thank you. Okay, so I know it's late, so I decided to cut a lot of the tables out so I won't overwhelm you with too many numbers. I'm just going to give you a flavor of this research that I've been conducting with various sets of co-authors. This is actually the beginnings of some new work based on some existing work that initially came out of my dissertation. So, and the name of my talk is Heterogeneity in Racial and Ethnic Price Differentials, Evidence from Chicago. Okay, so how do we get this going? So we hit which button? The green button. No, not that, the big green button. Okay, so I'm going to start with a basic fact that all of us kind of know. We've actually discussed it quite a bit, that there's been, substantial decline in kind of overt centralized discrimination, though I'm not sure Richard might argue with me a little bit. But despite this decline in these sorts of laws or this overt centralized discrimination, as described in various papers, such as a famous paper by Cutler, Glazer, and Victor, there's still a lot of evidence of persistent discriminatory behavior against racial minorities in the housing market. And so prime example of this is much of the audit literature. So examples, historically are papers by Yinger. There's some that I don't cite up here by Steve Ross, and more recently by these email correspondence studies by Hansen and Hawley. The one thing that comes up over and over is that the discrimination is coming through in a different way. Very few people are showing up and being told, no, you can't rent here, or no, you can't buy here. But there's a lot of evidence that steering and other forms of exclusion are going on. And what we're interested in this paper, what I'm interested in, but also in earlier papers that are related to this research, is asking the question that, if this discriminatory behavior is ongoing, how does it show up in transaction prices, right? We see these audit studies. These audit studies are kind of like experiments, right? But no transactions actually get consummated when you see these audit studies. And, I'm an economist, and many of people in this room are, and we're interested in what actually happens in the market, okay? And to help us think about that, I kind of go back to thinking about the reasoning that comes directly from Gary Becker, thinking about discrimination as limiting the choices or the size of the choice set faced by minorities. And in those cases, we would expect that minorities would actually pay more for comparable housing. And of course, as you might imagine, I'm not the first person who actually thought of this, nor are my co-authors. There's actually a large literature that studied these racial price differentials, okay? But one of the problems with much of this literature, and what I'm going to try to convince you of, is that we have, while we don't have a perfect solution for this problem, i.e. we don't have a randomized control experiment that we can conduct where prices are actually, houses are actually bought. What we're going to argue is that essentially we're going to overcome the principal problem that many of the observed, the previous studies are confounded by unobserved housing and neighborhood quality that's correlated with prices. So a classic example of a paper would be this Kane and Quigley paper, which actually finds evidence in favor of racial price differentials, that blacks were paying more for comparable housing or housing in the same neighborhood. And they were assuming that it was roughly comparable relative to whites. And Yinger found some evidence of that as well. But the problem with a lot of this early research, though it was interesting, is that they had really small, limited samples. Okay, and so they were criticized on the basis of not having, anywhere near enough power or variation in their data to actually say something profound. So later studies came along looking at kind of doing the same sorts of comparisons within neighborhood, and they, in these papers, largely find statistically significant discounts for black buyers, right? So, and so the question was, well, maybe since the decline of kind of these centralized mechanisms for discriminating against blacks, that what's happening now is that whites are essentially sorting to neighborhoods and paying more within their neighborhoods for housing than blacks would to live in that neighborhood. Now, of course, the big problem there is that whites tend to have more wealth, more income, and so all of these estimates, even though there are comparisons within neighborhood, are potentially confounded by unobserved house characteristics. And so probably most related to our research is this paper by Myron in 2004, where she actually tries to control for these unobserved house characteristics by including a set of house fixed effects in the model. The problem is she had a relatively small sample, so none of her results, even though she finds evidence of black premium, actually quite large, 10%, none of those estimates are significant at any conventional level. And another paper by Allen Felton Mayock, they actually use a large set of controls at the house level and block group fixed effects and they actually find some evidence of racial ethnic premium. But of course, as they note in their paper, that this estimate that they find, even though they find some small racial ethnic price premium, may be subject to bias because of unobservable house level characteristics. And so that's where we come in. And so in this original paper here, Pat Bayer, Fernando Ferreira, Rob McMillan, and I actually use transactions data from Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Baltimore, Washington, DC, and actually use a model that includes both house and neighborhood by time fixed effects to actually estimate a positive price premium of about roughly 2% for both blacks and Hispanics in all these cities. Okay, and I'm not going to hit you with every table from that paper, but basically what we find is that this thing is robust to almost every robustness check we can possibly throw at it that would be feasible. However, and as I'll note as a caveat to what I'm going to present to you today, which is related to this, is that we can't pin down a single source of discriminatory behavior. So what I'm going to argue before you get in your head that because I'm showing you price premium that I must be telling you that I'm finding discrimination, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you that up front just to stave off people shutting off their ears, right? That's happened a few times because some people don't believe that this discrimination is possible. However, I'm going to show you that statistically this price premium shows up over and over, and it's robust to a large set of controls. And I'm going to argue that it's at least suggestive that there might be some consequences to discriminatory behavior in the housing market. Okay, so in today's talk, just to limit the amount of time I take up, I'm going to focus only on Chicago. And I'm going to talk about some baseline results, and then I'm going to look at some results based on differences in neighborhood type, right? And so the reason I'm focused on differences in neighborhood type is because over the period that I'm looking at, so basically 1997 to 2007, this was a time in which, as many people in this room know, this was a time in which credit was actually relatively loose. And so you had, was kind of nearly a perfect experiment for actually looking at sorting across the city. And as a consequence, we saw that the city was rapidly gentrifying in some areas, whereas at the same time, because of this gentrification and because of other problems that I won't talk about here, but I can list them, such as crime and other changes in the South Side and West Side, you saw at the same time a resorting of the population, many black and Hispanics, for example, into the suburbs at the same time, while many of the inner city areas were gentrifying. And so, as a consequence, there's a possibility that some of these neighborhoods were changing differentially over the time, and we wonder if those neighborhoods might exhibit different premia relative to other neighborhoods, and whether that might be informative about what the source of these premia might be. Okay? All right, so what do we find? As I already told you, we find evidence of this positive Black Hispanic price premium across all neighborhood types, right? However, I'm going to show you some heterogeneity in the magnitude of the estimates, okay? So neighborhoods trending black or becoming blacker, such as neighborhoods in the inner ring suburbs and other parts of the periphery of the city, are going to tend to exhibit lower Black Hispanic price premium relative to other neighborhoods. Okay. However, I don't find any large differences in the estimated Black Hispanic price premium for neighborhoods trending white or those trending Hispanic, which was a little surprising because you would have thought that would line up more so with the Black premium. Okay, so let me give you a quick overview of the data I use in this study. Basically, I combine, and some of the people in this room probably have done similar exercises. We basically match all the housing transactions data in the metropolitan area between 1997 and 2008 with demographics from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, HMDA data, where we can get demographics such as race and ethnicity, reported income. Okay, and the nice thing about the DataQuick data is that not only do we have all this information such as transaction price, date of sale, loan amount, lender name, and house location, we also get this thing that allows us to implement a house fixed effects strategy. A unique idea a unique identification identifier for each house in the data that allows us to essentially follow it over time. And as I said before, using information in the DataQuick data and information in the HMDA data, such as transaction date, lender, census tract, and lender name, we're able to kind of match many of these housing transactions on the basis of these four keys. If you want to look at a good description and a good rigorous analysis of the match, look at the appendix of this paper, Bayer et al. 2017. It just recently was accepted into the Journal of Urban Economics, and I actually go through in that paper and show quite a bit how this match is actually quite representative of overall transactions in the area, as well as it's pretty robust to different cuts of the data. So, such as removal of subprime and things of that nature. Okay? And so just to give you a taste of the data, is there a mouse up here? Is there a mouse up here? Does the mouse work up here?
Just a clicker for advancing, not a mouse.
No, yeah, okay. Yeah. So how can I control if I wanted to control the buttons? I have buttons in my, so you can click on that for me? Can you hit return for me then? Thank you. Oh, that's new. Can you move it back then? Can you go back to the data slide? Data slide. Keep going backwards. Yeah, there we go. Can you click on the table here? Just to give you a flavor of what the data look like, these data look like in the time period that I observed, I focus only on repeat sales transactions, so I have roughly 382,000 repeat sales transactions over the period. There was over 1 million overall transactions, but since I'm focused on using the house fixed effects strategy, these stats are only for the repeat sales. And among the houses that sold repeatedly, the mean transaction price is roughly $220,000. Mean reported buyer income is around $86,000, whereas the median was $67,000. So there's some skewness in that distribution. 75% of the buyers over this time period were white, so overrepresented in the housing market, whereas blacks and Hispanics are roughly underrepresented. And then I have another category here that's very hard to kind of distinguish because it includes not only East Asians, South Asians, but it includes a lot of other types of people. And this is kind of another category, and they represented about 8% of the buyers in that. And as you can see here, most of the houses were sold twice over the period that show up in the repeat sales data. Roughly 20% were sold 3 times, and less than 5% were sold 4 or more times, which is good because we don't want any flippers in the data set. Okay, can you hit the return button, please? Thank you. Okay, so what am I going to do here? Well, I'm going to estimate essentially a repeat sales model for houses in which I include a vector of indicators for buyer race, ethnicity at time t. I have some buyer-specific characteristics at time t. But the key thing here is that I include a house fixed effect and a neighborhood by time fixed effect. Okay? And so what that's going to allow me to do is essentially identify the premia for changing race within the same house relative to neighborhood-specific trends in prices. Okay? And so essentially the way you can think about it, a lay way to think about it is that we're going to identify the premium relative, see if blacks and Hispanics are paying systematically higher prices within neighborhood relative to what we would predict if we just use neighborhood trends. Okay? And so basically, on top of that specification, I'll include a set of lender fixed effects as well to control for potential sorting across lenders, such as subprime lenders and so on and so forth. In the main paper, there's also estimates that we put in there that actually include no subprime loans. And so let's talk a little bit about the identification of the premium here, right? So like I said before, we're changing race within the same house over successive transactions, right? And so the way we're interpreting this is that the coefficients of interest measure differences in within-house appreciation for transactions where race changes averaged over comparable houses. Okay? That's a big difference relative to the rest of the literature, because the only other paper in the literature to this point that's been able to include the house fixed effect, it was the Myers paper, but she couldn't control for neighborhood by time potential confounders like we can. Now, of course, there might be some potential problems. I know the economists in the room are probably the wheels are turning in their head right now. What if buyers are systematically buying houses that had different amounts of renovation or maintenance? And what I'm going to tell you is that there's not much I can do about that other than use the flag that was in the DataQuick data and exclude those houses from the analysis. Now, our estimates don't change very much. But I'll give you another argument why I wouldn't worry about that too much. If you thought that because whites tend to have more income and wealth, they tend to buy higher quality houses, that would tend to cause this gamma effect that I'm interested in estimating to be understated in that case. Because in this case, this would actually push up the prices that whites pay in the data. Okay, so let's look at some results. Can you hit the table? Okay, so these are our baseline estimates for Chicago. Okay, and as you see here, in this baseline specification, I include house fixed effects and track by time fixed effects, and then we estimate a rough premium for blacks of around 2.93% relative to whites. Whereas for Hispanics, just including house fixed effects and track by time fixed effects, we estimate a roughly 1.5% premium. Once we include some individual characteristics such as polynomials in income and some wealth controls, so that we can control better for buyers' potential differing financial position, we see that the size of that premium actually increases. So if you thought that this premium was being driven by differences in the wealth and income of blacks and whites, you would have thought that the coefficient would actually go down once we control for that. Actually, it goes up here. And then we actually throw in the lender fixed effects just in case we have differences in the lender type. So for example, if you thought that blacks and Hispanics were more likely to actually use subprime lenders over this period, which they were, if you thought that was going to be a big issue, then I'm cool. then we would have expected the premium to go down as well. In this case, it stays roughly robust. Okay, and so can you hit return for me? And so basically what we find is that blacks and Hispanics pay premiums relative to whites, conditional on this research design, and it's robust to inclusion of buyer financial position and lender fixed effects. And if you go and look at the actual paper version, we actually show these results are robust for all cities to the exclusion of all subprime loans, exclusion of all transactions occurring between 2004 through 2007, if you thought the housing boom over that time was actually driving up these premiums, and the exclusion of non-perfect matches. So in some cases, we don't have perfect matches. They're pretty good, but they're not perfect, and it's not that driving these results as well. Okay, so let's look at heterogeneity across the neighborhood. Initial conditions, can you hit return for me? And so in this case, we look at Chicago and compare, this is the overall estimate, and then we want to look at neighborhoods that are roughly integrated, so roughly a little bit over 0.5% white, and then heavily white neighborhoods. And as you can see here, the premium are robust for blacks across those different neighborhood initial conditions. So basically, this is 1990, so before the observation period. This is based on 1990 composition. Okay, so as not to put in some sort of endogeneity. And basically what we find here is that for blacks, the premium actually goes up when you go to a whiter neighborhood, if you start in a whiter neighborhood or a neighborhood that was whiter in 1990, whereas for Hispanics, it's actually lower. And so some reasons why that might occur, can you hit return for me, please? So one reason why that might occur is that there's differential sorting for Hispanics across whiter and less white neighborhoods. So for example, one of my colleagues has done some work, Fernando Ferreira, showing that the Hispanics who tend to sort into white neighborhoods tend to be more likely to call themselves white, okay, or see themselves, tend to be more likely to be phenotypically white, and maybe they don't experience as much of a problem. But that's still a puzzle. That's pure speculation. And then finally, we're going to look at heterogeneity across transitional neighborhoods. So can you hit the table for me? Okay, and so in this case, I define transition as using the 1980 and 1990 censuses and look at the neighborhoods that are trending black over the time period. Okay, and as we can see here, in neighborhoods that are trending more black, the estimated black premium is actually much lower than the overall estimate, okay? And whereas the Hispanic estimate is not that much different. Whereas if you look at neighborhoods that are trending more Hispanic and trending more white, you actually see roughly similar to the overall estimates. And so one question that arises in my mind is that what's driving this? This is actually only marginally significant as well for the black estimate in neighborhoods trending more black. I mean, one possibility, so some people have taken this sort of evidence as evidence of discrimination, right? That blacks are having less of a hard time moving into to black neighborhoods relative to these other neighborhoods, and as a consequence, they pay lower premium. I'm not sure about that. Another reason that this could be is just looking at the neighborhood type. So in some of the other results, we look at non-Cook versus Cook County, and we find that in areas, most of these areas that are trending more heavily black tend to be suburban areas. And so there might be something different about those areas relative to areas in the city that are trending more Hispanic and more white, where most of the Hispanics are moving in. So that's actually something that I plan to investigate more. Can you hit return for me? So just to finish off, do I find discrimination? I'm going to say maybe not, okay? And I have some additional reasons why, okay? So we actually do a decomposition in the paper. It's hard to do it for one city, but we pull all 4 cities and do a decomposition of seller type, using the repeat sales structure of the data. And what we actually find is that actually blacks and Hispanics pay higher premiums when buying from blacks and Hispanics. And that sort of goes against our notions of kind of classical seller animus or racial animus or real estate agent animus. However, that doesn't mean that they don't face discrimination. Okay, and so you could come up with some stories in which that blacks and Hispanics, by virtue of, face some sort of statistical discrimination, because many of the issues, so say for example, there's historical discrimination in the city, they may incorporate that and may be less likely to bargain hard for homes as their white counterparts. Another possibility is that they just might have less experience, and that might be a source of statistical discrimination in the market as well. But nevertheless, it's unclear, but I think, ultimately it's not clear that this is pure racial animus, but something's going on, okay? However, regardless of what's driving these premia, the thing I want to focus on, and the thing that's actually been discussed around here today, is that these premia are, you can see it as sort of like a transaction tax. I got one more sentence. As a transactions tax. And so even if they're not purely from somebody saying, I don't want to sell to blacks, or I want to drive a harder bargain with blacks or Hispanics, if it acts as a transaction tax, it can actually have implications for actually tenure choice decisions, because they're paying higher prices for houses at the median housing price in our data. That's $5,000. That's not nothing, right? Could have effect on location choices, so which neighborhoods blacks and Hispanics move in relative to whites. And most importantly, as the discussion of, that's preceded my talk has spent a lot of time on, it might have implications for wealth accumulation. And so, like I said, it's what I want you to walk away from this talk thinking is that there is robust evidence that these price premiums exist. We need more work to figure out where exactly they're showing up and what the implications are. Thank you.
So now we have Bhash Mazumder from the Federal Bank of Chicago.
Okay. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. This paper I'm going to present is on the effects of the 1930s HoLC redlining maps. I'll talk about what the HoLC is shortly. And this is joint work with my colleagues Dan Aronson and Dan Hartley, also at the Chicago Fed. So I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this, given the earlier talks today. There's a lot of new research, exciting research, some of which Larry Katz talked about, that place matters for all sorts of socioeconomic outcomes. Where you were born or where you live is consequential for schooling, for long-term intergenerational mobility, and even for your longevity. There's also a very large literature, as you're becoming aware of, on racial segregation. So the intersection of place and race matters quite a bit. And Richard's talk at lunch talked about a multitude of historical factors, government involved, that could have led to racial segregation and the importance of place. What I'm going to focus on today is just one piece of that. And many of the things Richard talked about are potentially linked to these maps. So to just take one example, where highways were built and how that might have caused segregation could have been influenced by existing segregation that may have been influenced by these maps. But there are many other examples. So our key question, or our big picture motivation behind why we're looking at the maps, is this idea that this idea of redlining, of not lending to entire neighborhoods based on demographic characteristics, potentially led to urban disinvestment, that cities where there were these neighborhoods where lending essentially dried up, property values declined, and essentially, these are areas that then had the problems of concentrated poverty, et cetera, that we've been talking about. And also this idea that Richard mentioned at lunch, that if you look at the black-white wealth gap is quite enormous, that blacks have something in the order of 10 or 15% of the wealth level of whites. And there's this idea that given that the housing market is, your home is the primary source of wealth for most Americans, this long sustained increase in home prices in the post-World War II period, if blacks were shut out from the prime engine of wealth generation, that this could potentially be responsible. So there's a lot of debate among academics and the public about the role of redlining and the historical role of housing discrimination. But I would say that in the academic world, there's actually little systematic looking across lots of cities, looking very carefully at the data, and very little quantitative evidence of this. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. What we're hoping to do is to put some hard numbers and a good research design around this question. So basically what we're hoping to do is trace out the effect of these maps over a very long period of time out until the modern day period. So what we're going to find is basically that the maps led to increased racial segregation, reduced home ownership, lower home values, and reduced credit scores that show up in the modern day period. And the credit scores we're using mainly because we have highly precise geographic measures of that, and it captures overall financial well-being. I'll show you that the effects peak around 1970 to 1980 and then begin to wane. So for those of you who are sort of familiar with traditional segregation measures that have been mapped over time for racial segregation, a lot of the charts we've seen today are for income segregation, where the patterns have been this continual rise. For racial segregation, you see more of a hump-shaped pattern over the course of the century. And so, one key takeaway is that these boundaries that were drawn as a result of these maps 80 years ago are still reflected in measures of financial well-being today. One of the things, as we've worked on the paper and presented it more, is I think we've come to realize that maybe the most interesting finding is that these long-run effects are actually larger and more persistent in what I'll be describing to you as so-called yellow-lined areas rather than the red-lined areas, although we see effects in the red-lined areas as well. Okay, so what was the HoLC? Why did they draw the maps? So I'm going to take you back in time a little bit to give you some background on why this all happened. So essentially, after the Great Depression, we went through something similar to the financial crisis recently, where there were waves of foreclosures, banks closing, housing markets under a great deal of pressure. And the federal government essentially intervened and created a slew of federal agencies, including the FHA, which Richard mentioned at lunch. But a big part of it, even preceding the FHA, was the Federal Home Loan Bank Board in 1932, which set up the Federal Home Loan Bank System. And underneath that was a federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HoLC. And the government intervened essentially because of this concern that they wanted to maintain the stability of housing markets in the long run. They had the HoLC essentially buy and refinance many mortgages that were distressed, that were likely to go into foreclosure, essentially cleaning up the equivalent of the modern, toxic assets on the balance sheet of banks that would have otherwise gone under. So now the federal government had become a major player in the housing industry. And as part of this, it essentially changed the nature of housing finance to what most of us recognize today. So prior to these interventions, most mortgages were generally of shorter duration. They had to be rolled over. You might have a 5-year loan which represented maybe half the value of the house, and you would either have to roll over that loan or pay a jumbo payment at the end. And through this intervention in housing markets, we essentially shifted more towards long-term mortgages that were fully amortized, so something more like the 30-year fixed-rate mortgages where the FHA now insures the loan so the banks can provide it. Okay, so most of what the HoLC was really about was about refinancing loans, and they played a major role in essentially by, I think, 1935, 1 in 5 mortgages had been refinanced by the HoLC. And their work was pretty much done, except one other thing. The FHLBB, as part of this idea of the federal government now having a major stake in the housing industry, wanted to make sure that going forward, there was the appraisal process and the lending process was using the most scientific techniques available. And at that time, essentially what that meant, and the prevailing school of wisdom on appraising properties, was that what you needed to do was think about the neighborhood the property was in, and a key factor was the demographic makeup of those neighborhoods. Essentially, the racial composition and the ethnic composition of the neighborhoods played a major factor. And I'll give you examples of that and show you some of the historical evidence. So in addition to creating this sort of scientific appraisal process, the HoLC was directed to make so-called residential security maps, and these are the maps I'll be talking about, for all the large cities, essentially any city over 40,000 in population at the time. And basically, the maps broke down the cities into neighborhoods, and each neighborhood received a grade of either A, B, C, or D, and these were color-coded, as I show in the bullet there, with green being the best, all the way down to D being what was called hazardous. And I think the key point I want to make, there's a continuing debate among historians and economic historians about the extent to which the maps were actually used and how they influenced lending decisions, et cetera, that we're not going to be able to resolve. But if you read our paper, I think we provide fairly compelling evidence that private sector lenders were aware of the maps, that enough of the maps were created. The private sector lenders played a role in overseeing the maps, and that it's pretty strong evidence that the maps influenced the FHA, and the FHA in turn made their own maps, which also had a color-coded system of 4 neighborhoods, green, blue, yellow, and red. Banks that were regulated under the FHLBB, when they had their balances, their balance sheets reviewed, had to provide a map of where they were lending, and their maps had to be color-coded the same way. So I think there's pretty convincing evidence that the maps were being used, and I think I maybe show some anecdotal evidence of this. So I probably had the idea of writing this paper about 10 years ago, and had an RA start to look into this, and we quickly realized this was a pretty monumental task to try to get the maps out of the National Archives, digitize them, et cetera. So I kind of gave up. And a couple of years ago, I had a summer intern, and I was looking for something for her to do. I went through my list of defunct projects and thought, is there anything here I could resurrect? And she looked into it and some other RAs, and we realized that the University of Richmond Digital Scholarship Lab started digitizing these maps. And when we started the project, they had digitized about a dozen of these maps. So, a big shout out to them. This research would have been impossible. And over time, I kind of learned that there were a lot of important funders and academics behind the effort, so we really want to acknowledge them. So we got the geocoded maps, and essentially what I'm going to show you are the result of linking the maps to census data. And we're basically going to use census data from 1910 to 2010. The maps were drawn in the latter part of the 1930s, so you can think of 1910 to 1930 conservatively as pre-map. You can maybe think of 1940 as pre-map as well. And there we actually have the best data because we're actually looking at address level data. From 1950 to 1980, the best we can do, at least as of now, is tract level data. So we're going to have to kind of map that into the borders that we're going to look at, and I'll talk to you more about that. And then our next best data is in the modern period, 90 to 2010, where we have block level data. And I should say for 50 to 2010, we're going to be looking at aggregate data, not micro level data. So it's going to be essentially all 100, you can think of it as all 100% data. The 1910 to 1940 is 100% micro data, but we lose some observations in the geocoding and mistakes and transcription errors, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to look at credit bureau data as well for the modern period. Okay, so this is an example of a geocoded map for San Francisco, just to give you an idea of what the size of these neighborhoods look like. What we're going to be focusing on, and I'm going to talk about more, is essentially we're going to be focusing on the borders between the red and the yellow areas, the yellow, the so-called CD borders or DC borders, as I probably refer to them in the slides, and the blue and the yellow borders between the C and the B. And these are the vast majority of the neighborhoods. At some point, we want to look at the A neighborhoods and also look at the unclassified neighborhoods. Many of these were non-residential or business districts. But that's what we're going to be focusing on. Accompanying all of the maps are area description files that give you an idea of why the grades were made the way they were. So this is an example of an area description file for Tacoma in Washington State. Just draw your attention to a few things. First off, at the bottom of these forms, they gave the security grade. This is a neighborhood that received a grade of D or was redlined. There's actually a rich amount of information on quantitative variables related to the housing stock in the neighborhood. There's information on the age, state of repair, occupancy. There's survey data on home prices, all sorts of information that they took into account. So there's a lot of quantitative evidence. We're in the process of digitizing this. We won't have it for all neighborhoods, but we will have it for some subsample. So we're, at the moment, not really making use of that. But in addition to that, as I mentioned, a key component in classifying the grades was the demographic composition. So they looked at whether or not there were foreign-born families and where they were from, whether there was a Negro population, and they wrote, yes, there was a Negro population. What percent? 2%. So in this neighborhood, it was 2% African American. At the bottom, they show these clarifying remarks. And this is sort of a poster child for the importance of race as being pivotal in the grades. So they wrote, this might be classed as a low yellow area, if not for the presence of the number of Negroes and low-class foreign families who reside in the area. Okay, so we've gone through, we've run logit models predicting grades based on all the data we have in the census and race. And race comes up as significant, but I don't think you really need to see the regression results to kind of know that what was going on. So this is a bunch of additional evidence, very much in the spirit of what Richard said at lunch. You know, maybe if you look at a place like Berkeley, my grad school alma mater, you might think, oh, well, this is a more progressive place. You see something similar. The northeastern part of the area, north of the university, could be classed as high yellow, but for infiltration of Orientals and gradual infiltration of Negroes from south to north. So they were, again, clearly taking race into account. You know, this was happening all over the country. Race was clearly a pivotal factor. This is, you know, I pulled this slide together just yesterday to give you an idea of what Minneapolis looks like. If I did Google Maps correctly, we're somewhere over here. I put in a description for this redlined area north of us, Area 11. There weren't African Americans, as far as I could tell from the description files, many at least living in Minneapolis in these areas. They did write talking about ethnicity. So they mentioned the original population of French, Germans, and Irish are gradually being supplanted by Poles, Russians, Syrians, and Slavs, etc. So again, this idea of infiltration of lower class groups was key in their minds in grading these neighborhoods. Okay, so let me talk to you sort of quickly. There's a lot that we do that I'm not going to really be able to convey well in this short amount of time. But let me talk to you about how we're going to basically identify our effects. So we're going to focus on border comparisons. As I mentioned, we're going to look at red and yellow and blue borders. This is an example for New York City where we took all borders that I think were at least a quarter mile in length, where each side of the border was a different color. And then what we do is we create these boundary buffer zones around it. So we're going to look at 1/8 of a mile on either side of the border, and we're going to look at all households in these boundary zones, and we're going to trace this from 1910 to 2010. Okay, so that's going to basically be what you could think of as our treated group. And the reason that we focus on a border design is this idea that we hope, in principle, that among people living in such close proximity to each other that we've removed a lot of the confounding factors that might otherwise make it difficult to compare two neighborhoods. So along those borders, for example, transportation, a lot of amenities will be the same. However, we know that that's not perfect, and in some of our estimation, we found that there were pre-existing gaps even along these borders. So one of the things we wanted to do was try to create some type of counterfactual or control group, and we do that two different ways. One way is we draw a grid over each city. We find we sort of essentially create borders based on this grid within the same graded areas and find streets of a similar length, take a buffer zone around them, and find those streets that have similar gaps before the maps were drawn in various characteristics like their share of African Americans, home values, home ownership rates, etc. We also use some actual HoLC defined boundaries that aren't stuff we created, but where the HoLC gave the same grade on both sides. And again, we use statistical techniques to weight up these control samples to look just like our treated samples. Okay, so let me show you some results. So this will be for what we're going to call segregation. Now I should caveat that essentially what we're looking at is the share African American on two sides of the border, which is not sort of what how segregation is labeled in most of the research. I would actually argue I think it's a very reasonable measure of segregation, and we're actually using individual address level data, and I think more measures of segregation are moving in that direction. So anyway, let me quickly move on. So this is the blue line, which is largely covered by this orange line, is our actual HoLC borders. And what I'm plotting here is the gap between the C and the B boundaries. So this is what you could think of as the yellow lined areas compared to the blue neighborhoods. And what you see is the gap in the share African American was pretty much zero along these boundaries. So this kind of fits our idea. For these boundaries, there was very little that was different, at least in terms of demographics. And it was not really trending very much. There's a slight uptick in African American share, but something in the order of less than a percentage point. Let me say, yeah. I'll get to sidelined and I got less than 5 minutes. Okay, this is what happens after the maps are drawn. Essentially, you see the gaps open up in these yellow-lined areas so that by 1970, there's over an 8 percentage point difference in the share of African Americans on the yellow versus the blue areas. In our counterfactual group, again, that are created to look, just like our treated group in the pre-period, we see some increase in the African American share, but starts to level off, and you see nowhere near the increase. After 1970, you see this gap begin to decline, but there's still a significant gap even today that's larger than the gap that existed before the maps were drawn. This is the pattern you see when you look along the red-lined areas where we compare the red to the yellow along those boundaries. And here again, you see that there were pre-existing differences in racial composition, even just along these very tightly drawn borders that was rising over time. So this is why it's important that we create this control group. And we basically see a similar general pattern of rising differences in African American share along the borders that we don't see in the control group. I'm going to just quickly run through some results for home ownership and house values. The top chart is for the red-lined areas. The bottom chart is for the along the yellow and blue boundaries. And you see the gaps in home ownership exist in both boundary sets, but are larger and more persistent along the CB boundaries. You see something similar for house values. Here, our data is a little sparser because the census didn't collect this data in all years. And then finally, these are results from the credit bureau data that show that you see gaps in credit scores even in the 90s and 2000s along these same boundaries that were drawn 80 years ago. The bottom two panels are not just showing the credit scores, but the fraction that were subprime, so that you see along the actually treated boundaries gaps of something like 6 to 8 percentage points that don't exist along our counterfactual boundaries. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. This is some thoughts as to why we see bigger effects in the CB boundaries than the DC. This is just to show you that we see some heterogeneity in the effects across cities. And just to tie into this morning, Larry talked about this work on mobility that Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren have done, where he talked about the quasi-experimental effects based on people who move. And what we do here is we plot our city effects on segregation against the upward mobility estimates from Chetty and Hendren, and you see this somewhat striking relationship that's statistically significant, which is basically showing in areas that along these borders that became more segregated are also the cities in which you see lower upward mobility. Minneapolis is here, relatively higher upward mobility, and not much of an effect of the boundaries. Okay, so finally, I'll maybe just leave these bullets up for you to read. I think maybe the two things I would say, oops, can I go back? Yeah, is one, that when we do some back of the envelope calculations across our various outcomes, we think the effects of the maps account for something in the order of 15% to a third of the differences in the overall neighborhoods we're looking at. And we were asked to think about what implications this might have for the Fed and for policy. And one thing I would say is it highlights the continued importance of a pretty vital part of the Federal Reserve, which is the community development function that does a host of activities that I think can really be justified as a counterweight or a remediation to this historical legacy. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So now we have Samuel Mayers, who's law professor at the University of Minnesota.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Minnesota. This is the 9th District of the Federal Reserve. And for those of you who don't know, the 9th District covers Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, western Wisconsin, and northern Michigan, some of the whitest parts of America. And so I'm happy we're finally talking about race. So I'm going to stay on time, and I'm going to just give you my summary first. So Minnesota is different. And so Erica's presentation talked about, well, school districts are petitioning themselves, fragmenting themselves. In Minnesota, you can go to any school that you want, in any district you want, and you can get a rebate for the cost of getting your kid to the boundary between the school district where you live and the school district where you send your kids. Doug Neal, made a comment saying that, well, we should get rid of all of this bureaucracy for schools. Minnesota's gotten rid of this bureaucracy at school. Minnesota is a great place to live. We have some of the best schools in the country. We have students scoring at the top of the SAT. We've got a disproportionate number of Rhodes Scholars graduating from places like Roseville High School, for those of you who are from Minnesota. I mean, really, really good schools. But there's some major disparities in Minnesota. And so one thing I'm going to make a claim is that there's some huge racial disparities in home ownership in Minnesota that are far greater than they are elsewhere in the country. But that in 1940, home ownership rates in Minnesota were higher than home ownership rates for African Americans elsewhere. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point I want to make is that there are some non-trivial aspects, influences of lending disparities. The third point I'd like to make is that the Minneapolis Federal Reserve can play a role in helping to reverse these long-standing patterns of racial inequality in home ownership and in lending by enforcing the law. We have a law called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Okay, so that's the kind of a summary of what I'd like to do. So let's first talk about home ownership patterns in Minnesota versus the United States. So yes, it's true that home ownership rates are, for whites, are higher than for African Americans in the United States. Yes, it's true that white home ownership rates are higher than black home ownership rates in Minnesota. But when you look at the ratio of black to white home ownership in Minnesota versus the rest of the United States, the ratio was lower. The ratio was higher in Minnesota than the rest of the United States. And then as you move into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the gap widens, meaning that home ownership disparities are actually bigger in Minnesota than they are elsewhere. Okay, so the question is, well, why is this the case? And so 20 years ago, Myron Orfield was a chair of a committee that included state and local officials, bank lenders. It was part of something called the Urban Coalition because people in this state were really concerned. Because it's a good state. These are good people, and they're really concerned about these racial disparities. And one of the things that came out of the analysis of a report called A Dream Deferred, which was part of a goal that people in this community had to increase the minority home ownership rates. One of the conclusions was a strange conclusion wherein the home ownership rights for my students, the home ownership rates for my 24 to 35-year-old white students was higher than the home ownership rights for African Americans of every age group. That's a problem. So how much of the home ownership rate difference is due to income? The answer is, you have to live in this town. You have to go to a neighborhood 20 years ago called the Payne Fowler neighborhood, which is not too far from the old Ford plant, where the home ownership rates for whites with ninth grade education was higher than the home ownership for blacks who had college degrees. Okay, well, there's a problem here. If you believe that income explains the differences in home ownership, let's take a look at calculations from both the American Community Survey and from the 2010 census and census tract. So let's talk about poor whites. And let's talk about all white census tracts. You know, people keep talking about segregation as if the only segregation that exists is when people of color live in census tracts where there are people of color. Let me tell you, we have segregation, and segregation can be an all-white tract. And so let's look at all white poor tracts and calculate the home ownership rates for whites who live in poor white tracts. Of course, because it's a census tract, you have to be kind of careful about how you define it. So it's not 100% white. I tried 95% white. I didn't get enough, census tracts. So 90% white. Does that sound like it's very white? And then there's only one census tract in the whole state that is greater than 60% black. And so I would define a black census tract. Remember, this is Minnesota. This is not Chicago. I'll define a black census tract as 50% or more black. Okay? And then we'll talk about a poor tract, a low income tract, as 50% of the people having income under 50% of the median income. Okay? So, the home ownership rights for blacks and low-income black tracts is 18%. And the home ownership rights for whites and low-income white census tract is 33%. So whites are more than twice as likely, about twice as likely to own their homes than black. Poor whites living in all white census tracts have home ownership rates that are higher than poor blacks living in all black census tracts. Of course, there are different ways to calculate what the income in a census tract happens to be. You can base it on the income of people by their race, or you can base it, just take a low income tract, anything that has income that's less than 1/2 of the median income. And then 14% home ownership rate for blacks, and 33% home ownership rates for whites. Well, maybe that's not what you really want to do. Maybe what you want to do is calculate the home ownership rates. And by the way, this is not for the whole state of Minnesota, but for the 7-county area, sometimes called the Twin Cities. Let's calculate what the home ownership rate is for poor blacks. The answer is 10%. Poor blacks meaning incomes less than half of the median income. What's home ownership rate for poor whites? The answer is 53%. So here's the point. The point is poor whites are 5 times more likely to own their own homes than poor blacks. And we've run some regressions and we've tried to predict what are the probabilities of owning your own home within the census tract, controlling for a variety of census tract level variables. But I'm going to skip to a slightly different point, and that is lending. Because the vast majority of people who own their own homes purchase their homes through loans. And so we have something called the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and this is what Marcus has been using in his work. And first of all, the disparity in loan denial rates for home loan mortgages is larger in Minnesota than it is in the rest of the country, even though somebody at the Fed must have been doing something in 1990. Okay, so there was kind of a drop in the ratio of the denial rate for blacks to the denial rate for whites between 2010 and 2011. But since then, it's been going up, and the gap between the loan denial rates in Minnesota has been widening relative to the rest of the country. So, in the report that the Wilkins Center produced in 2015 called the Responsible Banking Report, which rated all of the 793 financial institutions in the metropolitan area, and using data from 2008 to 2013 with 1.18 million completed loan applications, of which there were 557 lenders that had at least 30 applications, so we threw out the ones that didn't have many applications. In that report, we gave grades based on CRA, based on the share of dollars that went to minority communities, based on the loan denial disparity, and based on something called discrimination. Turns out that 80% of all the home loans in the metropolitan area were accounted for by the 50 largest lenders, and 70% by the 20 largest lenders. For those of you who are familiar with this report, the purpose is that both the city of Minneapolis and now, I believe, St. Paul have responsible lending ordinances. The ordinances require that the potential lenders, banks that wish to do business with the state, with the city, print their checks, manage their portfolios, must be responsible. And so what this report does is it gives information to the elected officials about things like who happens to have a large share of their portfolios in minority loans, who happens to have ATM machines in minority communities, who happens to have big gaps in loan denial rates, and who has big gaps in the loan denial rates that are bigger than the gaps elsewhere in the metropolitan area. So let's look at the loan denial rates ranked from 0 to 100%. And so the dark color means that they're very high denial rates. The light colors, they're very low denial rates. And in this map for the 7-county metropolitan area, you see some strange relationships of really high minority loan denial rates in place out in the suburbs. And then little pockets of census tracts where there are high minority denial rates in the central city. And then this is the white loan denial rates. And throughout most of the metropolitan areas, whites have a pretty good chance of getting their loans approved. And then little pockets within the inner ring of the the inner ring suburbs and then the central city, whites have a very good chance of having their loans approved. Well, you can graph this. You can look at the distribution where the x-axis happens to be the rejection rate, the y-axis has to do with the share of all the lenders, and it turns out that there's pretty much like log normal distribution for white rejection, and almost a uniform distribution, a kind of flat distribution for minority rejection rates. And so this is for the Fed. I want the Fed to look at this graph and ask the question, if we are required to enforce the law and we have limited resources in order to begin to do audits, which of the different lenders I will look at? Do I want to look at these people up here? And the problem with these people out here, these people are stupid. These people are really small, inefficient firms. Or you want to look at these people down here, these people are the people who are doing a great job. Or do you want to look at something up here? Something that is wide differences where the ratio of loan denial rates for blacks for minorities to whites is 3 to 1 or 2 to 1 and so forth. I just want to suggest to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve that this information is helpful for you in trying to decide who you want to audit. But it's not good enough just to look at these disparities. You need to run some regressions in order to try to isolate what some of the possible explanations are for these wide racial differences in loan denial rates. And one common explanation is bad credit. And of course, in the paper, we do use a proxy for bad credit because the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act has a question in the form about why somebody got turned down. One of them is because of bad credit. You can use that as a first stage estimate. They got a proxy for bad credit. But wait until January 1st, 2018, because as of January 1st, 2018, you will have the credit score. You will have the other measures that are used in determining whether or not a person's loan is denied. And then GSE guidelines. Oh, we're not discriminating. We're just using desktop lending. And the desktop underwriting is, I've got to be able to sell this loan, and the underwriting guidelines have tied my hands behind my back. I'm required to turn you down. That's another possible explanation. And then you have the explanation of predatory lending. You have the explanation of adverse selection. But the explanation I'm going to test right now is discrimination. And so I understand that nobody in this room believes in discrimination. I understand that the kind of theory that discrimination can't exist in the long run in competitive markets. But just suppose that there is not conscious, explicit racist discrimination, because it's Minnesota. There are no racists in Minnesota, right? So instead, people thinking that they are doing the right thing, but it has a disparate impact. Guess what? That's illegal. Whether or not it does or does not smoke like, look like, taste like a Becker type of discrimination, it's still illegal. Okay, so I want to test that. And so controlling for loan amount, debt to income ratio, applicant gender, applicant income, predicted credit risk, characteristics of census tract, whether or not the percent black in the census tract, the poverty rate in the census tract, crime levels in the census tract, as well as loan type, whether or not this is a refinance, whether or not this is a home improvement loan, as well as year fiscal effects. And the conclusion is that there is a big unexplained gap, ranging between 65% to 71%. Now, this unexplained gap could be explained by, the quality of the driveway. So in my neighborhood, we are required to keep our driveways up. meaning that you have to pay $300, $400 every couple of years to do the blacktop on it. Moreover, in my neighborhood, there's a requirement that you have 2-car garage, no 1-car garage. Okay, fine. But guess what? There's only one black family in my neighborhood. And so what you need to be careful about when you talk about this unexplained gap is how much of it is something that is actually a part of the decision making and how much of it is something that can be interpreted as differential treatment of identically situated individuals. So my advice to the Minneapolis Fed is don't worry about the people at the University of Chicago who basically are saying that discrimination doesn't exist in the long run in competitive market. Don't worry about people who will say, oh no, we are so concerned about offending the major lenders like U.S. Bank, like Wells Fargo, like Twin Cities Federal. I mean, you know, U.S. Bank's name is on the stadium right there. We are so afraid of them because they're important to our business. My response is, U.S. Bank, if U.S. Bank is doing a good job, let's give them a gold star. If U.S. Bank is not doing a good job, let's call the president of the U.S. Bank into the room and let's have a conversation about how they can do a better job. Moreover, remember you saw some of the lenders doing a really good job. The ones that are off on that part of the distribution where not only is there no disparity in the loan rejection rate, but rather there's actually an appearance that minorities are doing better. Put them in your newsletter. Advertise it. And so my feeling is that we need to more vigorously enforce the existing law. Yes, understand that the Federal Reserve is one of 8 different agencies that regulates Equal Credit Opportunity Act. But that doesn't mean that you can't talk to the U.S. Department of Justice, which is the one to actually bring the suits, and to use some of your power of econometric analysis in order to provide information about who should be audited. And then finally, I think that we can talk about positive things in our community, like Stair Step Foundation, like the door construction. When you highlight good things that people in our communities are doing, what that does is that it reverses the perception about pathology. It changes the view that everything's bad. Because guess what? Things are really good in this state. Although the gaps are large, part of the reason why we have so many adverse gaps in Minnesota is not that people of color, not that African Americans are doing so poorly, but rather it's because whites are doing so well.
Okay, so our last panelist, Myron Orfield, the Law School of the University of Minnesota.
Thank you. Is this the...
Yeah, the green button.
The green button?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. I'm a law professor, not an economist, so I recognize I'm a little bit of a fish out of water. Sam was saying to me, what are you going to do when they start asking you hard questions? And I said, I'm going to keep it really simple. I want to talk, one of the things I think that's stimulating this initiative is the fact that we have such large racial disparities in the Twin Cities, among the largest in the country. And we didn't always have the largest racial disparities in the country. My background, before I was a law professor, I was a member of the legislature for 12 years and very interested in state and local government law. I worked in a big law firm. I also represented the NAACP for many years in Minneapolis. When I represented the NAACP in Minneapolis, we didn't have a single segregated school in the whole metropolitan area. In 1990, there wasn't one single segregated school. We'd go to national conventions and they'd say, this is not part of the United States, this is part of Sweden or Canada or something like that. We also had a fair housing program where we built, for 20 years, we built almost 70% of our subsidized federal housing in the whitest part of the suburbs. Richard was talking at lunch today about remedies, and he was saying, Romney had this idea of the open community program, but he got in trouble with the Nixon administration. They pushed him out. Well, Romney got one city to take him up on that. Minneapolis took George Romney up on the Open Communities program and tied all of its state and federal grants to the production of affordable housing in the suburbs. So for 20 years, Romney also doubled our HUD appropriation for 3 successive bienniums to do that, so that we could do that. He put some money on the table so that we could do that. So we did that for a long time. And one of the reasons we didn't have any segregated schools for so long was because we implemented George Romney's Open Communities program. We said if a community wanted roads, if it wanted sewers, if it wanted parks, it had to produce affordable housing. And our state housing agency made that housing available so that the community could do this. We had such a situation, we went from almost 100% of subsidized units in the poorest neighborhoods of the cities to 30% in the cities. And the cities were complaining about the small share that they were getting. And there was a reaction against this from developers and cities. So for a long time, we did everything that we were supposed to do. And for a long time, we did it so well. And we had comparatively small disparities. They weren't ever nothing. They weren't anything ever to be proud of. But they used to be smaller than average, and they were closing. When I was finishing up working for the NAACP, when they were shutting the order in Minneapolis, every year of that order, they closed the racial disparities in achievement and had more black children go to college. When that order closed in 1983 or 84, they had 150 young African American men in Minneapolis that were attending the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. Last few years, we can't find a dozen. So things have changed as we move back into segregation. I'm going to show you some maps of what happened when we abandoned our civil rights program, when we abandoned what Richard Rothstein said everybody ought to do, that nobody could do, that it was politically impossible. We also, for many years, asserted as a matter of state law that de facto segregation was illegal. So from 1973 until 1999, Minnesota asserted that under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, de facto segregation was illegal, and we withheld state aid. In fact, Minnesota's withheld state aid to segregated schools since 1869. So in 1869, Minnesota passed a law like Title VI, 100 years before Title VI, and said, we forbid funding segregated schools. So it's got a long history of this, a rich tradition. In 1999, we wrote a legal opinion. I'm a lawyer, and so I care about law, and I think it has an effect on the world. But in 1999, the Attorney General of Minnesota, it was Hubert Humphrey's son, which is one of the saddest tragedies, wrote an opinion that said there's no compelling interest in racial integration anymore. Now, what does that mean in the real world? It means a lot. Under the Equal Protection Clause, if you use a racial classification, you have to have what's called a compelling governmental interest. Ever since a case called Bakke, anytime you use race in a statute, anytime race has any implication, since Bakke and since the cases beyond that, you have to have a compelling governmental interest. So when Minneapolis issued an opinion, or when Minnesota issued an opinion in 1999 saying there was no longer a compelling interest in racial integration, it meant that our rule was unconstitutional. We could no longer regulate de facto segregation. It meant that any effort from a local school district was going to be viewed with great scrutiny. And one of the things the Attorney General started writing to people when they'd ask them about integration plans is, whatever you do, don't discriminate against the white kids. So this was a big change, and it had big policy implications. It had big implications for all sorts of discrimination. For employment discrimination, for housing discrimination, for school attainment, for health, for well-being. Since that period, since that opinion was issued, Minnesota's become a very different place, and the disparities between blacks and whites have grown dramatically. So I'm going to talk about the Twin Cities schools. In 2009, this is a map that shows the schools in the 7-county metropolitan area. We're one of the highly fragmented areas. We have about 50 school districts. Our last liberal Republican governor, Arne Carlson, tried to adopt a mandatory de facto desegregation rule for the whole metropolitan area. So our Republican governor proposed a mandatory de facto segregation law to eliminate desegregation as a matter of law, and our Democratic Attorney General said it was unconstitutional because there was no compelling interest in integration. That's what a tragedy we're talking about. At any rate, the schools that are red are more than 80% non-white, and you can see the central cities and many of the inner-ring suburbs are in the red and orange category, which are the highest minority categories. This first couple of maps are kind of hard to see because there's so much detail. When we get in, you can see the maps will become clearer. But you can see by 2009, we'd already had a pattern of segregation. 20 years into this, we started to get lots of segregated schools. We also are beginning to see the most rapid racial change not happening in our central cities, but in our first-string suburbs. We have suburbs like Richfield, that now their schools are 83% non-white. Brooklyn Center, the schools are virtually 100% non-white. The city of Brooklyn Park, which is part of the Osseo School District, has schools that are about 90% African American. Many of the suburbs now are more segregated or more isolated as a whole than the two central cities. Minneapolis and St. Paul are both about 80% non-white in their school systems. Now, Minneapolis is the third whitest metropolitan area in the country. Its racial counterparts are Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington. They have the same percentage of poor people and black people and Latino people. And when we enforced our civil rights laws, we were a lot alike. We tended to track Portland and Seattle. We have 109 schools now that are more than 90% non-white and poor. We didn't have any in 1990. We have 109 that are more than 90% non-white and poor. Portland has 2. Seattle has 25. Seattle's got 1 million more people. So from 1990, in the early 90s when we were the same as Seattle and Portland, our racial counterparts, now we're 6 or 7 times as segregated in our schools as they were. And our housing policy has built virtually all of our subsidized housing within the boundaries of these segregated schools. So it's a big change, it's a big difference. Why are we so different from Portland and Seattle? I think it's the way that we enforce our laws, it's the way that we enforce our programs. This is a map that shows poverty. Let's see if I can go back. And again, this point that many people made today, Sean Reardon made today, is poverty and race locked together a lot, particularly in the Midwest and Northeast. If you're poor and African American and Latino in the Twin Cities, 3/4 of poor African American or Latino kids go to overwhelmingly poor schools. If you're poor and white in the Twin Cities, the majority of poor white kids go to majority middle class schools. And that's true here. It's true most of the rest of the United States. So when you're talking about poverty, and almost everyone agrees that high poverty schools hurts kids' achievement. Almost nobody disagrees with that. People talk about the implications of racial integration, but there's no real strong disagreement with the principle that high poverty schools depress graduation rates, depress college attendance, depress later life earnings. Nobody really disagrees with that. And we've created a lot of them. We've created 100 or more of them, and we're creating them at a faster rate than any part of the country. This growth in segregated schools is faster than any place in the country. Nobody's done this fast in this short of a time. And it's not just housing policy, it's school policy. And again, you can see the change, a lot of the racial changes in the inner-ring suburbs. Now, here's subsidized housing in Minneapolis, and these are the neighborhoods, the shaded neighborhoods are the high minority neighborhoods. And the darker the shade, the higher the percentage of non-white citizens. And these are subsidized housing projects. And you can see that Minneapolis has a pattern of building subsidized housing projects in a very segregated cluster in neighborhoods. Minneapolis has built tens of thousands of units, both Minneapolis and St. Paul, in the boundaries of segregated schools, that had they been built under our old housing plan in the suburbs, had they been built in places like Minnetonka, which was turned down last year for affordable housing so that we could build it in the city, or Lakeville, which has been turned down, or Edina twice that's been turned down, there would have been a very different outcome. Minneapolis was sued in 1975, a fair housing violation for building 68% of its units in high minority neighborhoods. Last year, the last few years, it's built 85% of its units in high minority neighborhoods. Not only that, but both central cities have what you'd really call a truly dual system of affordable housing. They have a group of housing called artists housing. And they build housing for artists using the low-income housing tax credit. And they figured out, these clever financiers have figured out how to double up with the historic tax credit. And they build projects that cost $700,000 or $800,000 per unit. And they're virtually the only subsidized housing Minneapolis is locating in white neighborhoods. And guess who lives in those? White people. And not even artists all the time. So this is a pattern that didn't happen suddenly. These disparities in Minneapolis didn't happen suddenly. They happened when we changed our law and when we changed the way that we viewed the Equal Protection Clause and the civil rights laws. Another thing we found is that these units in these poor neighborhoods are more expensive than the units that we used to build in the suburbs, or that we continue to build on a smaller scale in the suburbs. So these units in Minneapolis cost at least 1/3 more per square foot than the units do in the suburbs. On the Central Corridor, I'm going to show you a bunch of units that were coming in about $300,000 or $400,000 per unit for a 2-bedroom apartment. Same apartment building built in a suburb called Eagan, our low-cost provider, was $133,000. So you could have built 3 units in Eagan for one in St. Paul in a 100% poor segregated neighborhood. Why do they build them in these segregated neighborhoods when they're cheaper to build in the suburbs? And when the suburbs here, like in Minnesota, are willing. I think that we've created an industry of affordable housing that likes to build in poor neighborhoods. And one of the reasons they do is it's easier and there are more subsidies available. One of the subsidies that are available uniquely is one that the Fed, I think, could be looking at, the Community Reinvestment Act. So you have Wells Fargo, which Sam's talked about. Wells Fargo and many of the large banks, we have some of the largest disparities between black and white lenders in the country. So a black family in the Twin Cities, black household in the Twin Cities that earns $165,000 a year is less likely to qualify for a prime loan than a white household that earns $40,000 a year. That's the HMDA data. And of course, it doesn't have credit history in it, but it's a pretty big disparity. It's hard to make sense of that. $167,000, a black household systematically that earns that is systematically less likely to be approved for a loan than a white family that earns $40,000 a year. Yet Wells Fargo and all these big banks have perfect ratings from the credit rating agencies. Why is that? It's because they invest in building housing in poor segregated neighborhoods. They don't donate their money to build housing in these poor segregated neighborhoods. They invest and receive a nice rate of return to build these units in segregated neighborhoods. And it's one of the reasons they're more expensive is because this community reinvestment money is on the table for those kinds of units. It's not in the suburbs. So you have this program that's supposed to be revitalizing these neighborhoods, and banks that are not systematically not loaning to black households, and they're getting perfect credit scores, and they're at the same time contributing to racial segregation. This needs to be looked at. Another thing that's happened is, why doesn't the Fed, and Sam said this more eloquently than I could, why doesn't the Fed look at these disparities? They're the largest disparities in the country, and they're associated with the largest disparities in other fields. Other Feds have gone and looked at the credit history data. Other Feds have asked these banks, let's see your credit records. Now, a person like me, they'll say it's a proprietary. A fair housing lawyer, it's proprietary. It costs a fair housing lawyer $500,000 of depositions and court costs to be able to look at this credit history data. And whenever they get a chance to look at it, people settle pretty fast. You could do it in a second. You could just look at this right now. And the other Feds have found that these credit histories don't explain the disparities. They explain some of them, but not all of them. What about these low-income housing tax credits? Is it sensible for the Community Reinvestment Act to give people a nice 10%, 8%, 10% return on building segregated neighborhoods? Is there other things that they could be doing to reinvest in these neighborhoods, improving the schools, maybe contributing to health care, maybe tutoring? But to invest in the concentration of poverty, I think this is a thing that it's important to look at. If we care about segregation, and everybody's been talking about segregation, why should we be using the Community Reinvestment Act to incentivize segregation? This is the low-income housing tax credit, again, highly concentrated in poor neighborhoods. This is the Minneapolis Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Another reason that private developers, often surrounded by not-for-profit entities in central cities who are promotional affiliates with very, very successful private developers. Minneapolis generously, it's a liberal city, puts money on the table. Another reason that the units are more expensive, because Minneapolis puts money on the table, community reinvestment puts money on the table. In the suburbs, all you've got is state and federal funds. And there are dozens of developers that get turned down in white suburbs every year by our state agencies who can make a perfectly good living building this housing in white suburbs. We turn this down because there's an industry that likes to build it in poor neighborhoods, and the margins are much bigger in these poor neighborhoods. You build in a white neighborhood, you have at least 20 meetings to go to. I can tell you this from experience as representing a white neighborhood that built affordable housing. It takes a lot of time and effort to hold everyone's hand. But that's what we should be incenting people to do, is holding those hands. We shouldn't be incenting a mass industry. The industry in the Twin Cities is a $300 million industry with 8,000 employees that's had a 25-year business plan of segregation, segregation, segregation. And it's time to look at that. It's time to see if we can put some incentives in that industry that are integration rather than segregation. Minneapolis in an abandoned civil rights, its schools resegregated. In the land of Hubert Humphrey, when we declared as a matter of law that there's no compelling interest in racial integration, Minneapolis went from a court-ordered integrated system to one of the most segregated cities in the country. So I'm going to show you a time series of the schools in Minneapolis. This is the year Minneapolis was released from legal supervision, 1995. Every one of those circles is an elementary school. The racial composition, the blue share is white, the red share is black, the yellow is Latino, the orange is Asian Pacific Islander, the green is American Indian. I'm going to show you a time series, and it's going to show you that Minneapolis moves from an integrated system that I had the privilege of attending under court order. I'm the Earl Larson Professor of Law. Earl Larson integrated my high school under court order. I had the privilege of going to an integrated high school because of that decision. Minneapolis moved from an integrated system to 3 systems: a white system in the southern part of the city, south of the lakes, a Latino system in the near-south system on Lake Street, and a black system in North Minneapolis. In the white system, they have higher test scores than Edina. We were talking about the testing in the neighborhoods and the value of neighborhoods. In the white part of Minneapolis, you have kids that go to Yale and Princeton and Harvard. They say in North Minneapolis, kids don't go to college. We can't find kids in college in the schools, whether they're charter or public schools, a few. But a lot of them are ending up in the criminal justice system. They say if you go to Lake Harriet School, you go to Yale, and if you go to North Star, you go to jail. And there's not, that sounds harsh, but it's not wrong in lots of ways. Now, here's Minneapolis. Watch what happens as we go out from court order. You see the schools change. And you start to see the schools south of the lakes become all blue and all white. You see the schools in the near south become red and yellow, which is black and Latino, and then Latino. You see the schools in North Minneapolis become black and Asian, and then black. 3 different school systems, 3 different sets of opportunities, 1 superintendent. If this bureaucracy is the problem, if it's all about big schools and big labor unions and big teachers, how come the white schools in southwest Minneapolis produce higher scores than almost anything but the most exclusive private schools? How come the white schools in southwest Minneapolis, with all this bureaucracy and terrible structure, why do they produce the state chess champion team year after year? When the schools across the city with the same bureaucracy but are segregated produce a whole different set of opportunities. This is free lunch, and you see as the schools become white, all the schools in the southwest quadrant lose all their poor kids, and all the schools in the middle of the city lose all their middle-class kids. Another thing that happened when we moved to this neighborhood school system, people left. Minneapolis went from 50,000 students to 30,000. And we created a huge network of charter schools, another great competition idea. Those charter schools now, about a third of the kids in both central cities go to charter schools. And every peer-reviewed and published study on those charter schools showed that they've underperformed the public schools with similar demographics every year since they started. Maybe this idea of competition, wasn't the best idea, particularly when people are competing in different ways. Test scores I've talked about. You can see the south of the lakes, some of the highest test scores in the state. North, some of the lowest, except in Indian reservations in northern Minnesota. Subprime crisis. Guess who got hit hard? Sam talked about this. Poor neighborhoods. The only time you saw black ownership rise was when the predatory lenders moved into these neighborhoods. Some of the biggest people that have settled the biggest claims for predatory lending have been Wells Fargo. One of the biggest. Wells Fargo settled hundreds of millions of dollars of claims against Baltimore and Memphis, and the disparity patterns weren't as great there as they are here. Some of these banks, if you read the depositions, I challenge the Fed to read the depositions in the Wells Fargo case and read what 25 of the Wells Fargo employees said about their loan practices throughout the country. They are striking depositions. I think that they bear examination. But you see the subprime mortgages, look at the parts of the suburbs in the city that are racially diverse. They devastated, they saturated these neighborhoods. And then they wiped them out. They came in and they wiped out the equity, they wiped out the strength, they wiped out the resilience of these neighborhoods. They were predated. And you can see the white parts of Minneapolis, there were no subprime loans, virtually none. And you can see the whiter part of the suburbs either. You can see the diverse parts of the suburbs, the Brooklyn Parks of the world, again, predated. No action taken. Foreclosures, same thing. My maps get repetitive, and I get repetitive. But the points that I want to make is that we have very good laws in Minnesota. We still have court decisions that say the Minnesota Human Rights Act provides the Department of Education with legal authority to outlaw de facto segregation. The U.S. Supreme Court, unlike the Minnesota Attorney General, holds that racial integration remains a compelling governmental interest. Justice Kennedy, writing for the United States Supreme Court, says racial integration is a compelling governmental interest and that it remains an important and unfinished part of the American agenda. That's what the Supreme Court says now. We should follow Justice Kennedy and try to implement those rules. We've got a system where we moved from building 70% of our subsidized housing in places that have integrated schools to 8%, the lowest measure that we've had since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. Who was the author of the Fair Housing Act? Walter Mondale. Who was the author of the 1964 Civil Rights Act? Hubert Humphrey. Where did Ward Wilkins come from? St. Paul. Clarence Mitchell, a great black civil rights leader, came from Minneapolis, an urban league. We have a long history and good laws, but we have profound segregation, and it's highly correlated to the really ugly inequality that we're experiencing between black and white people. It's hard to think about these things being so coincident. And that we aren't looking at the largest, that we aren't actively examining the largest lending disparities in the country by looking at this credit history data is a shame. That we are rewarding developers and banks with high profit margins to build in segregated neighborhoods and satisfy their community reinvestment obligations. This is a shame. We should be doing just the opposite. We should be doing what Justice Kennedy said, trying to finish the unfinished business of America, to have a truly integrated society, what Martin Luther King called the beloved society. We have all the tools in history to do this. No place in the country are the schools becoming segregated faster. No place in the country are these areas of dense segregation in the central cities growing faster. And there's no excuse for this. If Portland and Seattle aren't doing this, it can't be that hard. It can't be that impossible. I think we've got to examine our own practices. We should look at the way we finance housing. We should look at where it's built, who's building it. Another thing about this is we're building all this housing in these poor, segregated neighborhoods. Who's building it? Are there any black contractors that are building this? No. Are there any black leaders of community housing investment corporations? One or two, very small ones, but the larger ones are people that are white. The people that run these organizations are white. They live in neighborhoods like mine. They live in the suburbs. There's almost no benefit that's going. If we're trying to develop the community, there's nobody in the community getting any jobs. There's nobody in the community getting any training. It's just another big profit center to create a system of exploitation of these poor neighborhoods that runs from banks to check cashing stores to the people that make high profits building segregated housing and are using their political power to keep housing out of places like Edina and Minnetonka and others that are showing some good faith in trying to do this. Anyway, I've talked longer than I'm supposed to. You have a law professor who used to be a politician, and that's a common pattern. But I think I challenge you to look at this credit data and to look at the Community Reinvestment Act. Are banks making a profit investing in building segregated housing, using no people in the neighborhood, hiring no people? Is that community investment, or is that profiteering and creating segregation? That's the question I'd ask.
Thank you. So I'll start from the questions from the audience, and then at the end, as a residual claimant, I'm going to ask some questions myself.
Well, I actually have an assignment for Marcus's students. Marcus, you're probably aware of this, but in the 1970s, research, pretty good research, showed that the Cook County assessor assessed African American homes at a much higher ratio to market value than white homes. The community with the lowest ratio of assessed value to market value was Mayor Daley's neighborhood of Bridgeport, and the community with the highest ratio of assessed value to market value was Lawndale, West Lawndale. Are you familiar with that study?
No, I'm not.
Okay, well, I'm going to send it to you because you have a unique data set that wasn't available to people in the 1970s. You actually have the real market values. They had to use comparables.
Right.
You could get some undergraduate research assistants to look up the assessed values of communities in Chicago and compare them to the market value, to the recent sale prices.
No, I actually have those values in the data as well.
Okay, and what do they show?
Even better.
What do they show?
I've never done that ratio.
Yeah, well, okay. I
That's
just urge you, because
interesting.
this was a pattern not just in Chicago, but elsewhere in the country. But Chicago was one of the places that we had the best survey of that kind of thing. So, and then I just want to make a comment about one thing that Myron said. I can't resist this. He said that everybody agrees that if we have a school with high concentrations of poverty, that it's faced with enormous challenges. But there's an exception to that. The only people who didn't agree with that was a majority of Congress and the President, who in 1981 passed a law saying that schools with high concentrations of poverty fail only because of low expectations. And we're still living with the residues of that law. And it impedes our ability to do the real things that are necessary even in those schools.
Other questions?
Thank you all for your presentations. I guess I'm curious, particularly with Myron's presentation, there's a lot of data now showing housing unaffordability going up in central cities and concerns that gentrification is happening and that communities are going to change over time as people can no longer afford to rent where they've rented generationally even. So I guess I wonder how you would respond to people who are concerned that stopping investment in the city, though it might be less efficient, will not protect or preserve those communities.
Yeah, I think this is a centrally important question, and I think it's something we have to think about. What is gentrification? We have neighborhoods in Minneapolis where the average income, these are segregated neighborhoods, has declined in real terms by 1/3. Now the rents, corrected for inflation, haven't changed at all in a decade, but the incomes have declined by 1/3. The poverty housing industry, this industry says that's gentrification. It means that we have to build all the affordable housing in these poor neighborhoods because the incomes have declined by 1/3. People can no longer afford their rent. Now, a person like me thinks gentrification is when white people start to push black people out of neighborhoods that are integrated. It isn't. Gentrification doesn't occur when you have a segregated neighborhood that loses 1/3 of its income. That's not gentrifying. That's becoming poorer. Now, I think you should build affordable housing in poor neighborhoods, just not all of it. I think the Fair Housing Act says you have to build about half of it in integrated neighborhoods. You can't build all of it in poor neighborhoods. Now, the poverty housing industry says, first of all, they say they're redeveloping these neighborhoods. They say that by building these low-income housing units in poor neighborhoods, they're causing economic revitalization. Well, I don't think there's any evidence of that anywhere. The second thing they say is there's gentrification in these neighborhoods. And they say that both things. These housing developers say both things. They say they're bringing the neighborhoods up, and they say we have to build more housing in these neighborhoods because they're gentrifying. And I wonder which is which. I mean, these neighborhoods are becoming poorer. There's no question that these are becoming poorer. And there's also no question that neighborhoods are on the lakes, like in Uptown and the lakes, the rents are skyrocketing. These are neighborhoods that seem to be gentrifying to me. You know, the Uptown and the lakes, parts of Edina. Are we building any affordable housing in these neighborhoods where the rents are skyrocketing? Nothing, except artist housing.
Other questions? Okay, so I'll ask a question to Bhash. At the end of your presentation, you didn't have time to go into it, but you talk about for future research thinking, trying to explain what's the mechanism behind the patterns in the data that you find. So I was wondering if you have thought about that, if you think about that redlining generated a decrease in rental rate in those area zones like these zones, and these created migration waves that increased the home ownership rate, the African American rate there. First and second, I guess you have two sets of results, right? One is that the gap in African American shares has stayed high even after the redlining was active, and then second that the home ownership rates have been also divided in different zones even after the end of the redlining. So I was wondering if you are if you're thinking about it as it may be that it's all about the fact that there is segregation and just the ratio of African American can explain the gap also in home ownership rate, because we have seen in the presentation, for example, of Samuel, that there is simply discrimination for lending to African Americans, or do you think there is something beyond that really due to the segregation, the geographical, the spatial component?
Yeah, so I think the two questions are kind of related because they're both about what are the series of events happening that are resulting in the results I showed you, which I didn't really talk about much, and is really a challenge because of the data needs. I mean, in an ideal world, we would see, lending data from lending institutions, denial rates, rents, year by year, see the population flows, all of the kinds of things we'd like to see. To what extent is the shifts in the population causing the changes in the housing market values, or the extent to which it's other forces. So it's really difficult to disentangle. I can say a few of the things we can try to do. So I showed you the city level variation. We can look at some historical data on differences in banking concentration, differences in initial levels of segregation. A few other things not coming to mind now. We have a very large to-do list. So we're going to try to sort of see if we can look at some things that relate why some cities experienced bigger effects than others. I didn't get a chance to show you, but we do look at the evidence of population along the borders, and black population and white population along the borders, to try to get a sense of how population flows resulted in these racial gaps. And there is an interesting pattern that it looks like along the DC boundaries. You see much of the increase in the racial gap being driven by white flight out of the D areas. And in fact, for foreign-born, you see it mimic the white pattern. But along the CB boundaries, the yellow-lined areas, you actually see white population stay roughly similar and black population increase. So there's some interesting dynamics we haven't quite gotten our head around. One caution is that I think that our home ownership effects aren't huge, and they could be, to some degree, there could be an endogenous response as prices come down in these areas. You could have higher home ownership that doesn't that to some extent equilibrates part of what's going on. So I don't necessarily think of them all as capturing the same thing. So I don't know. That's probably all I can say about mechanisms.
Thank you.
So I'd like to just add a dissenting opinion about the presumption that segregation bad. So in your maps, you looked at Minneapolis when there weren't many blacks living in Minneapolis. And the reason is that there was a black community in St. Paul called the Rondo community, where there were doctors, where there were lawyers, where there were intellectuals, where the guy who ended up being the editor of the Minnesota Daily and who then became the president of the NAACP between 1954 to 1954 to 1978 lived. What happened to Rondo? The answer is we built a highway right through Rondo. What was the home ownership rate? It was 80%, an 80% home ownership rate. And what type of businesses you have? You had banks, you had fraternal organizations, you had restaurants, you had barbershops, you had churches. So I'm not quite sure that the problem is segregation. And it turns out that we do have some segregated enclaves in places like Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park. And Myron has been an opponent of having Section 8 housing in this largely black community, where we have a black city administrator, where we have black individuals involved in local politics. You've got nice Liberian and Nigerian restaurants if you want to get fufu or jollof rice. And they got a 50-meter swimming pool with a wading pool and with a diving well. And I just want to ask you, what's wrong with segregation? Is the problem segregation, or is the problem lack of ownership? Living in a neighborhood where nobody owns anything, where all the homes are rental and so forth. So I just want a dissenting opinion about segregation being the problem. Moreover, you're talking about minority segregation, black segregation. If you say segregation is the problem, what about the all-white neighborhoods in Atlanta? What about the all-white neighborhoods in Minnetonka? We keep talking about black segregation, minority segregation as the problem. That means we, black people, are the problem, and I disagree.
Yeah, I think that this is it's an important question. I think this is, people I think that want to choose to live in segregated neighborhoods should have that choice. I think that anyone that chooses to want to live in an all-black neighborhood I think they should be able to do that. Nothing I ever said that says that nobody should have that choice. I just think if the only choice for people are, if you build all the government-subsidized affordable housing in a poor segregated neighborhood, then you don't have that choice. And I just think people ought to have the choice. And if they choose to be together, for a long time, a lot of American groups chose to be together, and they found comfort in this. When my family immigrated a long time ago from Europe, they lived in a neighborhood of choice like this. But most Americans disappear into the fabric of America, and that's their choice. But nobody should be stopped from this. Now, I looked at the Gallup survey just a day ago, and I looked at the Roper survey, and it says 85% of African American families believe that integration is an important goal. And that's not everybody. And certainly there's 15% that don't agree that's an important goal. 85% think it's critically important to their kids' education in those polls. Now, that's not everybody. And those 15% of the people that don't should be able to have those segregated places if they want them. But the question is, we just don't have very many integrated choices for the 85% of the people that say they would like that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. I can tell this is definitely not the time for a long speech. So let me just say three things. First, let's all thank all of the presenters who've been here today. Second, as you know, to make any conference run smoothly, there's a lot of people in the background doing a lot of work. Last time I tried to name everyone and I mispronounced their names and forgot a few people. So this time I'm just going to say thank you to everybody in public programs and in research behind the scenes who've made today work so smoothly. Thank you. And lastly, let me say this is the first year of the Opportunity Inclusive Growth Institute. We intend to continue. We intend to pick up the gauntlet that's been thrown down today to look hard at some of the data on discrimination in mortgage lending and elsewhere. And we'll be continuing to convene next year with at least two more conferences. So please look out for those. Also, we'll soon be announcing the next invitation for people to apply for our Visiting Scholar program. That announcement should go out quite soon. So please, if you're interested and would like to come visit, I hope you'll consider it. But also, please pass along that information to other people you know who might be good candidates. We'd like to have as good or better a group of visiting scholars next year as we currently have this year. We have a fantastic group so far, and we hope we can continue to build on that. So thank you very much. Safe travels, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year.